Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of John Adams, beginning our series on the history of the 4th of July, featuring the Founding Fathers. Before John Adams became the first Vice President of the United States under George Washington, then the second President of the United States, the first resident of the White House, and the writer of the Massachusetts State Constitution, he was one of the creators of the Declaration of Independence during the Revolutionary War. What was John Adams like? How did he and Jefferson get along? What were his views on government and religion? John Adams was a member of the Committee of Five and was 7 years senior to the 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. But he realized that Jefferson was the more eloquent writer. Jefferson asked Adams to write the Declaration. However, Adams insisted that Jefferson do so, arguing to Jefferson, "Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." Later, Adams wrote, "Was there ever a dramatic surprise that had so great an effect as Jefferson's penmanship of the Declaration of Independence?" Adams saw to its completion. Benjamin Franklin, the most senior member of the committee, was aroused from his bed to finalize it. The 70-year-old gentleman, Ben Franklin, had been bedridden with gout. Then the remaining two members of the committee reviewed it, Robert Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, likely without further change. Let's talk about John Adams' friendship with Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was his vice president when John Adams was president. They first met at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1775, developed a strong mutual respect, and formed a close friendship. In 1784, Jefferson joined Adams in France on diplomatic service for the new nation. Adams did most of his work in England and Holland, while Jefferson stayed in Paris. But they met up in London after Jefferson had finished some of his diplomatic business. Afterward, they toured together, visiting English gardens and Shakespeare's home in Stratford-on-Avon. They were friends for 51 years, with one significant exception. They parted ways around the time of the contentious presidential election of 1800. Adams served only one term, and the acrimonious election saw Jefferson's narrow political defeat of Adams. But they were reunited after a dozen years, first through the effort of Adams' wife Abigail to Jefferson, then through the encouragement of another founding father, Benjamin Rush, for Adams to write a New Year's greeting to Jefferson. Jefferson responded. While they differed on many subjects, including American federal political theory, the French Revolution, and slavery, they nevertheless exchanged 158 letters with each other in the last years of their lives. Adams wrote to Jefferson, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." Perceptions of John Adams. Thomas Jefferson once wrote of Adams, "He is so amiable that I pronounce you will love him if you ever become acquainted with him." Ben Franklin's appraisal of John Adams was, "Always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes and in some things absolutely out of his senses." Alexander Hamilton wrote a pamphlet about Adams entitled "Letter from Alexander Hamilton Concerning the Public Conduct and Character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States." In it, he observed that Adams is a man of an imagination sublimated and eccentric, propitious neither to the regular display of sound judgment nor to steady perseverance in a systematic plan of conduct. But David McCullough, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography John Adams, describes Adams this way. The common superficial understanding of him as vain, irritable, obstinate, difficult, and opinionated, that little fat fellow between two Virginians, Washington and Jefferson. The fact is, he was full of life, high-spirited, affectionate, loyal to friends, a kind and a dedicated father and husband who traveled further in the service of his country than anyone before him, and at greater risk. Here is John Adams on religion and government. Adams was a descendant of American Puritans, that means Calvinists, and grew up in a New England Congregational church, where his father served as a deacon. When many Congregational churches turned toward Unitarianism, Adams followed suit. He was also fully exposed to the European Enlightenment while in France, ensuring that he would become a free thinker. He was suspicious of priests, either papistical, meaning Roman Catholic, or Presbyterian, and he fervently declared that it was not the case that only Calvinists would go to heaven. On the other hand, despite his animosity toward Calvinism, John Adams extolled the sovereignty of God in a language of the most profound feeling. Whenever he spent any time thinking of the enormity and grandeur of the universe, the Milky Way, and the stupendous orbs of the sun, he said, "I feel an irresistible impulse to fall on my knees in adoration of the power that moves, the wisdom that directs, and the benevolence that sanctifies this wonderful whole." In acclaiming God's greatness, Adams also recognized his and humankind's finiteness. "Worm, confine thyself to thy dust. Do thy duty in thy own sphere." Adams was a man of deep spiritual conviction and personal morality. As a lawyer, he had defended the British soldiers who shot into a crowd, which would become known later as the Boston Massacre. When the shop of a printer who had often written against him was on fire, he joined the Bucket Brigade. Despite eschewing religious orthodoxy, he later said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Now, neither John Adams nor Thomas Jefferson signed the U.S. Constitution. Adams was serving as minister to Great Britain, and Jefferson was minister to France, but they both supported it from abroad. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1813, Adams wrote, "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. I will avow that I then believed, and now believe, that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God." Was John Adams prescient? He exchanged over 1,000 letters with his wife Abigail, his sounding board. He wrote to her on July the 2nd, 1776, saying, "The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the Day of Deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parades, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forever." As a prophet, he was a visionary, and his prediction was only off by 2 days. John Adams on the topic of the Republic. Like other founding fathers, he preferred a representative republic to a democracy. He was skeptical of the rule of the masses, writing, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.